in person and virtual. So I really appreciate you coming out tonight. So I'm going to just do a really short reading of my book, Reprieve. I'll give you just a little background, tell you a little bit what it's about. It's about a murder that takes place in what's called full contact haunted attraction. And essentially what it does is it follows the life paths of the people who were involved, or not necessarily involved in the murder, but who were there on the night of the murder. Specifically, it follows three characters. There's Kendra Brown, who is a black teenage girl who grew up in D.C. and moved to Nebraska after the death of her father. And then there's JD, who is a Thai exchange student who comes from Thailand to the United States to study and to find this guy that he had, or this teacher that he had a crush on in Thailand. And then there's Leonard, who is from Nebraska. He's a hotel manager, and he has a specific business relationship with John Forrester, who is the owner of this full contact haunted attraction. So yeah, it follows those three, but there's other characters that are involved, but those are the three main characters whose points of view you follow in the novel. I'm going to set you up just a little bit for what I'm about to read. I'm going to read from Kendra's perspective, and Kendra ends up working at this full contact haunted attraction as a parking lot attendant. And at the end of the season, which is essentially November, they have a big party. And she's not allowed to go into the haunt. The haunt is in the basement of the house. She's not allowed to go into the haunt because she's underage, but she wants to sneak into the haunt. And so the portion that I'm going to read is her sneaking into the basement, okay? Sneaking into the haunt, all right? The only other things you need to know is Christy is another coworker of hers. She is also a parking lot attendant. And Sean, who is mentioned, he is one of Kendra's love interests, and he lives in Washington, D.C. Okay, so I'm just going to read this section. Before Kendra could object further, Christy grabbed her hand and pulled her through the kitchen into the adjoining hall, where she was suddenly surrounded by dark, the hall lit only by seeping moonlight. Her airways constricted. She concentrated on her breath. 2 doors on the west wall stood ajar. One led to a storage room, one to a closet. Christy, her smile gleaming, chose the door to the storage room. Careful, Christy said. Her voice came from below. She was kneeling. Watch your step. Kendra heard a creak. I can't see, she said. Isn't there a light? No, Christy said. Here, take my hand. It's a trap door. Be careful. Kendra descended a series of metal steps, each footfall unsteady, clanging. Grab the rail, Christy said. If we can't see anything, what's the point? She said, grabbing the rail. We'll see things, Christy said. Once we're down there, I'll find the light. Marcus showed me. Once they both stood on solid ground, Christy said into the dark, just wait here, don't move. Kendra waited by the stairs, holding onto the rail, ready to bolt. The air was down. She felt suddenly that she was violating an important trust. I'm going back up, she called to the darkness. Wait, Kendra, Christy said from somewhere remote. A long wheeze sounded above, and then, white light, Kendra shielded her eyes. Aha, Christy said, there we go. Kendra blinked, looked around, her hand still firmly wrapped around the handrail. The room was impossibly large, empty, and gray. A scoreboard was mounted on one wall, turned off. Around her, she felt movement. Rats, mice, snakes. In each corner sat a miniature jail cell. Iron bars connected to concrete. In the northeast cell was a shadowy human figure seated in a red folding chair, its face obscured by a green gas mask. Holy shit, Kendra said. Don't worry, Christy said, standing a few feet from the cell. It's just a prop. Christy walked into the cell. Her steps echoed. She became small. Well, hello there, Mr. Mask, she shouted. Aren't you a scary, scary thing? She giggled, patted the top of the figure's mask. Very, very scary. Kendra shook her head. She knew from movies that this was the point where they were supposed to play around with the monster in the chair. Christy, the pretty blonde, would talk to it suggestively, maybe give it a lap dance, while Kendra, the no-nonsense black character, would say, "I wouldn't do that, please don't." Minutes later, the monster-slash-killer would disappear only to reappear behind them with a weapon, slashing to pieces the black character who had ultimately been deemed inessential to the storyline. Christy looked out at Kendra, put her hands on her hips. "Jesus, Kendra," she said, "are you just going to stand by the stairs? I mean, you want to see, so look around. It's a little ridiculous, isn't it? Look how low budget everything is. Just a room with 4 little jail cells. But this is what, cell 5? If anyone gets here, they're pretty beaten up already. And it's pitch black, and everyone goes mad in pitch black." The figure stood up. Kendra screamed. Then she laughed. "Lone Tree," she said, "is that you?" The figure towered over Christy. It wore bib overalls, a flannel shirt, work boots, all streaked with blood. Christy turned around. The figure stretched out his arms, lifted Christy by the shoulders. Christy squirmed, her feet jerking in the air. "Yes, very impressive," Kendra said. She looked up the stairs, chuckled. "But don't worry, Christy. You and I both know that the black one always dies first." She thought then of The Shining, the movie she forever associated with this sort of tokenism. It'd been the biggest disappointment of her entire movie-watching career to see Dick Halloran axed by Jack Torrance. Halloran, a black man who'd had the gift of The Shining, who'd communicated cosmically with Danny Torrance, who'd been en route to enacting full-fledged heroism, had met his demise not 5 minutes after he'd arrived at the Overlook Hotel. 5 minutes. His single line inside the hotel had been, "Hello? Anybody here?" "Kendra," Christy shouted. "Help!" "I'll get right on that," Kendra said, grinning. "Hold tight." Sean had turned angry at the Halloran murder scene. He'd said, "I'd rather they just not put a black person in a movie than have them die so meaninglessly every time." "But everyone dies meaninglessly," Kendra had said, though she too felt gutted. "You know it's different," he'd said, his face long and fuming. "You know it's not the same thing at all." In the jail cell, the killer man's masked face was inches from Christy's, peering thoughtfully. Christy screamed. Kendra felt momentarily unsettled. "Kendra," Christy said, "please." The man in the mask whipped Christy against the bars. Kendra flinched. "Just take off his mask," Kendra said, mentally inventorying everyone she'd seen at the party. "Kendra," Christy said. She was on the floor now, having somehow gotten free from the monster's clutches. She was crawling away, slowly. "Help!" "Christy," Kendra said, her stomach nodding. "Really, this isn't funny. This isn't just help," she said. "My leg. I can't move." Christy edged out of the cell, tried to stand up, but fell. The masked man looked at her, cocked his head. "Jesus," Kendra said. She looked at the stairs and back at Christy. "I guess we're playing this game." She ran to her coworker, bent down, put her arm around her shoulders. When they were halfway across the room, wheezing, grunting, sweating, the stairs folded up into the ceiling. Kendra turned around. The masked man moved slowly, and in his hand, Kendra now saw a weapon, a glistening silver hatchet. "No," Kendra said. "Seriously?" She ran down her, sweat ran down her forehead. Christy was heavy on her arm. "Kendra," Christy whispered, "my leg. I think it's broken." The masked man stomped closer. Kendra's hands shook. What the fuck, she thought. Next to her, Christy's breathing became labored, moistening her neck. Kendra surveyed the room. About 50 feet away was a door. "Is that where we go?" she said. "Kendra," Christy said. Kendra pulled on her coworker, but her weight was too much. "Come on," Kendra said, thinking again of Sean. Would she ever see him again, or would she die down here, a pathetic virgin? Would she? No, none of this was real. It couldn't be. This was a game. From behind her, she heard grunts, the slow-moving gait of a bloodied man in a mask. "Everyone in horror movies should always err on the side of caution," Sean had said during one of their early horror club meetings. "It's their disbelief that gets them killed in the end." "Christy," Kendra said, panting, "did he actually hurt you?" Christy didn't answer, just let out a terrific scream. "Oh, fuck! My leg! Oh, fuck! I can't hold you up much more," Kendra said. "You have to," she said. "You need to be honest with me here," Kendra said. "Oh, God, we're gonna die," Christy said. "We're gonna die." Kendra stopped. Now she knew. There'd been no need to err on the side of caution. Disbelief wouldn't get her killed. She probably wouldn't die a virgin. She looked down at Christy's face and saw, through the mess of tangled hair, a monstrous grin. "Just save yourself," Christy said, draping a hand over her forehead. Save yourself. I knew it, Kendra said, and dropped Christy, who stood up perfectly fine on her own. The monster took off his mask. Yep, Kendra said, of course. John Forrester shrugged, smiled. You like the night vision mask? Military grade, and this hatchet looks so real, doesn't it? He ran a finger across the edge, plastic. All an illusion, Kendra, he said. Everything. The stairs dropped back down. Kendra ran to them, looked up and saw Sarah peering down at her, grinning. Take off his mask, Sarah chided. Just take off his mask. I'll give you a proper tour soon, John said, walking over to her. You've definitely earned that. Kendra shook her head. I never thought any of it was real, she said. Take off his mask, Sarah repeated. Take off his mask. Soon the rest of the crew stood around Sarah, joining the chant. Take off his mask. Take off his mask. Kendra climbed the steps, still shaking her head. Dark heat swirled around her cheeks and ears, but when she reached the hallway and saw Sarah's pointy face smiling into hers, scratchy embarrassment immediately reverted to cool, easy friendship. Who'd have thought, she wondered. Me with a white girl feeling mushy. Who'd have thought? She hugged Sarah. Sarah hugged back. I'm so glad to have met you, Sarah said. I'm glad too, Kendra said. Christy and John joined them in the hall, both of them beaming. John put his hand on Kendra's shoulder and said, Your family. I know, Kendra said, I get it. Your family, John repeated. And she felt in that moment like she could possibly leave her entire DC life behind her. If she had this, if she had Quigley, she could maybe fashion an existence for herself here. She could maybe survive. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Channeling. All right, so here we go. So Reprieve is a kaleidoscopic novel that starts with the premise of a murder, talked about in Full Contact Haunted House, but intertwines the lives of all these characters who were there when it happened. Can you talk about that process of how these disparate parts came together? Did Kendra, JD, and Leonard come first to you? And why did you decide to integrate the haunt into their lives, even in a structural level?
Okay. Yeah, so to answer that question, I have to talk about the genesis of this novel, which is really complicated and weird. So I originally was going to write, I started with this idea that I wanted to illustrate, and that idea was racial fetishism. And I thought the place to put this novel, if I'm going to talk about racial fetishism, is in Thailand. So I wrote this entire story that took place only in Bangkok and Pattaya. So I had this, I wouldn't say it was a full novel length, but I had a pretty long story with these characters that took place in Pattaya and Bangkok and some South Thai stuff. And so I was gonna, I was researching Thailand. I went to Thailand. I was just gonna have this Thai novel essentially. But as I was writing this, I was on YouTube one day, and I like to scroll through upcoming horror movie trailers because I like horror movies and I like to see what's coming out. And I I came across on the sidebar, in the suggestions sidebar, there is a video for a full contact haunt, and I'd never even heard of these things before. I didn't even know they existed. But I was immediately intrigued. I was who would go to one of these places where you essentially get beat up? You pay people to go and beat you up. And so I clicked on the link, and the link, I mean, it was horrifying. It was these people would go there, and these ghouls, these people in these masks and all bloodied up, would torture them, and it was filmed. It was they would, it wasn't just beating them with their fists. It was electroshocks. It was drowning. It was simulated waterboarding. It was like eating things that like you shouldn't eat, you know. And like it was all done in this dingy basement. This was like one of the really extreme ones. So like they run the gamut. There's like full contact haunts that are not this extreme. You basically will go to these places and you'll just get like maybe a little shock or something, or people will like grab you in the dark. And that's still considered a full contact haunt because most haunts you're not allowed to touch the people. So it's still considered full contact. But then you have the opposite extreme where people go in these places for hours, like, you know, and just get subjected to this torture. And so as soon as I watched this, I became sort of obsessed with it, and I started writing a book about it. I was like, I want to write a book about it. I had John Forrester, I had this other character, Corey, and I had Leonard. You know, basically white dudes make these things. Yeah, so I had those dudes like doing, making, you know, this full contact haunt. But I also had this Thailand story, and I was just like, well, what do I do with it? And I was just like, I thought thematically it made so much sense to merge the stories, because like the horror of racial fetishism and the horror of like what these guys are doing in this haunt, really, it just made sense to intertwine those stories. So I did. It took a lot of work to make those stories come together, but I just wanted it to be one story. A lot of the Thai stuff got cut. There's like, in the book, I think there's only like 2 sections that are in Thailand now. You know, that's kind of how it started, and that's the reason why we have the haunt and we have the Thai sections.
Wow. Cool. Kismet. Okay, so it's set in 1997, but of course the themes around fetishization, sexual and racial identity, and capitalism are very relevant, to the point where actually I'm in the middle of this book, and I kept like turning back to the first page to be like, it said 1997 on that page, right? And then I wrote yes. Is there a particular relevance to choosing that time, and has the pandemic, including the rise in Asian hate recently, influenced how you view the journeys of your characters? There's a lot of questions here, so go ahead.
Yeah.
What do
Yeah.
you want readers to take away?
I mean, okay, let's just talk about the 90s.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the 90s. I've been asked this question a lot. I've been asked this question, why did you set this in the 90s? And there's like a number of reasons, and I don't know if there's a single reason, but like the 90s were like a really interesting decade that I feel like gets lost between the two monoliths of the 80s and the aughts, you know? It's like basically like being a Gen Xer. It's like you basically get lost between like the boomers and the millennials, you know? So like the 90s were like, I mean, personally, I came of age, so to speak, in the 90s. So, you know, it was fun to like talk about Hootie and the Blowfish, you know? So, I mean, there was that. But it was also a very interesting time for horror, because like you had this huge decade of the 80s, which was like slasher, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street, and like, Halloween. You had all the 80s slashers. And then you had the 2000s, you had like found footage, and you had, torture porn, basically the Saw franchise, and like, and Hostel. You know, you had that become like really popular, but the 90s didn't have any definitive like thing, you know? The only definitive thing that happened in the 90s was Scream, and I don't think that was really definitive, to be honest. But you had some really smart horror. You had like Jacob's Ladder that happened in the early 90s, which was really amazing. And then you had some like offshoots of like really terrible 80s horror. Like, I don't know if you've watched really terrible 80s horror, but like Ghoulies and Chud. I actually mentioned Chud in the book. Chud stands for Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers. And they're just these things that crawl out of the sewer. And then there's also the Ghoulies, which are these like little gremlin type things that crawl out of the toilet. And they were like really popular in the 80s. Oh, and there's also Leprechaun, which was Jennifer Aniston's like big break, if you didn't know. But there's this really great. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but there is this great. It's been. I don't know if you go on YouTube and you look at this particular video. I think it's got like millions and millions of hits. It's like, it's in Leprechaun where they're tearing apart some guy, and it just looks terrible. And this guy in his glasses just kind of looks up. He's like, they're killing him, and then they're going to kill me. Oh my God! And it's like the camera goes right on his face, like really close up to his face. I don't know. It's probably not that interesting to you, but it's really funny. But so I don't know. There is some of that in the early '90s too, but. Yeah, I mean, the 90s were, like, I think, like, a really great decade. But they were this weird decade. As far as, like, what he's talking about, like, social issues, they were also weird that way because, like, you know, I don't know. Like, you know, people were talking about race. People were talking about gender. People were talking about sexuality. But they were talking about it in a different way than they talk about it now. You know, they were talking about it I mean, there is still, like, residue of, like, the 80s, like, pre-80s, and I'm thinking like, you know, of the AIDS epidemic, of like how in the 80s it just wiped out so much of the gay community, and then the 90s, you know, it was still wiping out the gay community, but there were people living. So again, it was kind of that transition decade, and it was just all very ambiguous, and I love ambiguity, and so sure, that's maybe one reason I said it in the 90s. That's a long answer.
No.
I just wanted to talk about Leprechaun.
Well, I'm very happy to have the explanation of Chud, because I did, like,
oh, there's like
read
6
that
of them.
Kendra talks about it in the book, and I was like, what is that? Okay, let's talk about the characters more closely.
Okay.
Was there a particular character that you struggled with more in developing? And can you talk about the origin story of your favorite character?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Kendra was the most challenging. Kendra, like as I said earlier, she's a black teenage girl who grows up in D.C. and moves to Lincoln, Nebraska after the death of her father. And, you know, inhabiting that reality was difficult. It's a reality that's very different from mine. I mean, I'm not a black teenager from the city, you know, I'm a, you know, Asian guy from North Dakota. So like inhabiting that was really, was difficult, and it was challenging. How she started though was she wasn't even a main character in like the earlier drafts. She was just this side character. She was Corey's next door neighbor. And she does get involved with the Quigley House, but not to the extent that she does in the in the book now. But I just really loved her. Like there is a scene where she gets locked out of her apartment and she doesn't know what to do, and she's this black girl in Nebraska, and she feels very isolated already, and she feels very like, you know, like the eyes are on her because she's now in the Midwest, and she came from, you know, D.C. where it's majority black, and then she comes to the Midwest where it's majority white. Like Lincoln is like 3% black, and she's trapped. It's like the middle of the night in Lincoln, Nebraska, and she's trapped outside her apartment because she forgot her key because she was just going outside to get a breath of fresh air. And like I loved that scene so much, and I loved like inhabiting her at that point that I just rewrote everything and decided like she needed to be a main character. But it was tough. I mean, I had to read. I mean, I read a lot of black female authors. I think it was very important to do that, just to get, you know. It was just really important for me to do that. I mean, just to inhabit that reality that's completely not my own. I mean that whole family, because her and Brian and like her family, I wanted to, you know, do it with as much care as I could. So she was definitely the most challenging. But like to answer the second part of the question, I think because it was the most challenging, she ends up being my favorite.
So I want to nod at a couple of lines. First off, what does it mean to be different from JD, a Thai international student navigating the mixed cultural signals of America as he attempts to become someone his former teacher could love? So what does it mean to be different in a country that prides itself on individualism yet is deeply conformist?
That's a loaded question. What does it mean to be different? I think nowadays what it means to be different is that you don't feel the need to showcase yourself. I mean, I feel like right now there is just this bizarre need to like show every single thing about yourself like to the world, and I don't think I think people who are really different just maybe just do things and they don't care about what other how it's perceived or whatever. It's just like I think maybe right now in today's world, it's more about like you don't have a curated life. Everyone, I mean, if you don't have the curated life, you're leading, I don't want to say authentic life, but like it's a little, you don't have the duality of like having like your life, your authentic life and your curated life, which to be honest is very confusing for a lot of people. And it's very confusing for other people to like interact with people who have such a huge curated life, but then like have this immensely different personal life. So maybe that is maybe a reason that you're different. The thing that she's referring to in the book, I'll just mention, is like this scene where JD goes to the mall and he sees, it's one of my favorite scenes in the book actually. He goes to the mall and he sees this poster for a shoe, and the shoe just says "Be different." I mean, the advertisement for the shoe just says "Be different." And so they're trying to sell this shoe by saying like, if you wear this shoe, you will be different. And what JD thinks is he's like, well, I don't understand that because they're trying to get as many people as possible to buy this shoe. So if as many people as possible are buying this shoe, they're all the same. They're not being different. So how is that marketing? I mean, how do people not see that? And it's like this kind of American hypocrisy of like being like this idea of ardent individualism versus like this idea that like being conforming is the only way to be in America, but everyone is priding themselves on how individualist they are. So that's something I just wanted to talk about in that scene.
So early on in the novel, Kendra and her sort of boyfriend, Sean, are talking about the nature of horror. And Sean says, horror tests limits, horror shows us who we are. Can you talk about why a haunt, where everything is supposed to be artifice and commercial, is a perfect nexus for your characters to come together?
Okay. I've been talking a lot about horror in the last few weeks. Just people have been asking me questions about what is horror and why are we drawn to horror. And there's this whole scene in the book where people are talking about like, where Sean talks about, he's the president of this horror club. He's talking about why are we drawn to horror, what is horror, and what makes horror like compelling. And I think that's a question I ask myself all the time because I was drawn to horror when I was young. And it's not because I love blood and guts. It's not like I love seeing people eviscerated. It's not because I love demons and all that stuff. It goes a lot deeper than that. I think people who enjoy horror, a lot of people who enjoy horror have felt at one point pretty outsiders in their lives. They felt like, I'm not, I don't know how to be in the world, and I definitely felt that growing up. And so when I read Stephen King books, and what Stephen King did so well was that he showcased outsiders. Outsiders were always the main characters, and outsiders were the heroes. And suddenly you could see yourself reflected in the larger world. You could see hero, yourself maybe being a hero. All of these, kind of geeky, outside, weirdos are banding together to confront this terrible, demon or something. And I loved that, I also love just the imagery of horror. It's kind of beautiful, I mean, some is. I mean, some is just gross. But like, if it's done well, it can be really, really beautiful. But I think another reason people are drawn to horror is like people have asked me a lot about these haunts and why people go to them, and they're such a huge thing, especially now in October. But like, people feel safe in them. It's weird. It's like you go into a haunt, everything is like manufactured. Everything is not real. And you get to escape from like the horrors of your daily life, which are many. And you get to just like enjoy yourself, like being startled by these really weird looking people, And so I think, that's another reason why I think we gravitate towards it. I mean, I think some people gravitate towards it because they like revenge, they like, there's a reason why a lot of these like slashers are populated by like the popular kids. They're populated by like, cheerleaders and jocks, and you get to watch them get slaughtered in horrific ways. And so I'm sure some people are like, yeah, take that for calling me whatever when I was a kid. So there's a lot of reasons. But.
Yeah. Same theme. Reprieve contains horror, but is not a horror novel. If you're not historically a horror, or you are not historically a horror writer, so the question of genre is always slippery, especially as more and more novels and films are doing a lot of merging of traditions. Can you talk about the importance of the horrific in entering dialogues of modern issues?
The importance of the horrific in entering modern issues. I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, I think like the horrific doesn't necessarily need to enter in modern issues. I mean, like modern issues are just generally horrific in themselves, so like we don't need to add any more horror to them. But yeah, I mean, I think one thing that happens with horror is that we're sort of stripped. I mean, if anyone's a horror fan, I mean, like what happens is like you're stripped down to your primitive self in horror a lot. Like something happens where, like when your life is at stake and the people that you love, their lives are at stake, something very authentic emerges. Like you have, like, it's kind of that fight or flight thing, but like what you're made of really comes to the fore. Like when somebody is like threatening your life. And I think like we love to see people stripped of their inauthenticity. We love to see people at their most primitive. I mean, I think it's a reason why reality TV is so popular, because what they do is they just throw people who they know aren't going to get along together in a room, and they tape it, and we're just like, oh my God, this is so great, this is so compelling. But we love that because what's happening is they're stripped of like that artifice. They're stripped of like, they don't have to be polite to each other. They can't be polite to each other, and we like to see that. And that happens with horror in the most basic level. Yeah.
Can you nod to any other books, films, media that helped you kind of navigate this space between literary and horror? Kind of talk about the origin story of this book already, but
Yeah.
were there any books that you sort of were thinking of once you decided to merge this all together?
Well, books and movies. I mean, I think horror is undergoing like a really interesting time right now. I mean, with Get Out and Parasite, you have like the blending of like the literary and the horror elements, and you get to talk about these really pressing issues, which I think horror does so well. I mean, with like Parasite, you talk like almost explicitly about class. With Get Out, you talk explicitly about race. And so like, yeah, it's a really great vehicle to talk about these really, really pressing issues. So yeah, I would say those. I mean, other books. I mean, like, I don't know, American Psycho, for instance. Like, I mean, it was definitely gross, but it was also like a commentary on 80s materialism, you know. So I think when horror does it really well, it, you know, or like, you know, The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, what is that? A commentary on feminism, you know? Like, it's just, it does it really well. I mean, it doesn't have to do it well, but when it does do it, it can be pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Well, shall we open it up to questions from these fine people?
Sure.
All right. Anybody got a question?
Since you talked about movies, do you have film rights?
Yep.
Are film rights available, or have you signed anything?
Are they available?
Are you offering to pay?
No, I think it'd be great though.
I'm in talks. I have an offer, but I haven't accepted. So it's out there, and I'm still talking to people.
Good luck.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I found Leonard and JD both just like crushingly cringy for different reasons. Very difficult to read. And I just found a lot of similarities. Like their perception of their relationships were just so wildly out of like reality.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those two a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, those stories go to the heart of the fetishism theme. So if you like, okay, so essentially they're unrequited love. So JD has he's Thai, and he has a white English teacher while he's in Thailand. And he comes all the way to the States to try to find this white English teacher who doesn't even remember him, who doesn't know who he is, who doesn't really care about him. Conversely, you have Leonard, who's undergone this relationship that's been full of problems, and they wind up breaking up. And he goes to Thailand and falls in love with a Thai prostitute, you know, who is the same, who has no interest in him as far as a love interest, but he thinks that he's in love. So what I wanted to do there is, like, you know, I wanted to talk about like how, because I think this is like a thing that actually happens in the world, where people think that they're in love with people based on very superficial or very like reductive things. So like when we're talking about fetishism, it's like, so Leonard feels like he loves his prostitute because of everything that he thinks she represents. He doesn't care about her as a person. He has no interest in her life. But everything that she represents, the way he feels in Thailand, you know, the way he feels so powerful in Thailand is like all represented in her. And so he thinks that that's love, you know. And I think that, I think people do that, you know. I think they find somebody, they find like a representation. They have like these ideas of that person based on their own stereotypes, and they fall in love with that person without really caring about what that person is. There's this scene in Leonard's section where he's in Thailand and he's talking to Poonsi, which is the prostitute, and he hasn't ever asked her a question about herself, but I go into her perspective for one paragraph. And it was really hard for me to not go into her perspective for longer than that, because in earlier drafts, she was a main character. So I knew her entire story, like from when she was a child. But like I knew if I was going to stay in close to Leonard's character, I couldn't do that. But it was so hard. So I took license and I did like a paragraph in her perspective. But yeah, both of them, like they like this representation, but they don't really know the person. And that's like the foundation of fetishism, racial fetishism to me.
Any more?
Sure. It sounds like the book had a lot of drafts where I like started in like very disparate spots. Was there something that like locked the story or the novel as it is into place that like, I don't know, like solidified a lot of the themes that you were exploring? Was there like a moment that happened, or was it just gradual over time?
I think it was gradual over time. I think it was really hard to weave in the narratives because they did feel so like separate. But I had to change the characters completely. So like JD like wasn't who he was in the other. He was like sort of this renegade. I mean, I had this whole thing about the South Thai separatist insurgency, and he was part of it. Like he was like trying to not. He was like basically protesting against the Buddhist government, and like to make the story work, I had to completely change him. So he had none of that anymore. I mean, now he was a student that came over to the States. So there wasn't like a specific point where everything changed. It was just like a matter of what I wanted to do with the story in Nebraska and how I could weave in the Thailand stuff. Yeah.
So, if you had another question, go ahead.
Sure. So, the book is about like a fake haunted house with like fake ghosts. So what was useful for you for that instead of like a real haunted house with real ghosts? Why set it in like a manufactured horror setting instead of some place where like the monsters are like real?
Yeah. Well, when you talk about like real ghosts and stuff, you're dipping into the supernatural, and like I feel like that's something that I'm doing with my next book, but it's not. This one I wanted it to be grounded in reality as much as it could, and so that's sort of the reason I did it. I didn't want there to be any supernatural elements to it. I wanted it to be scary on the level of like, I didn't want the scares to come from supernatural elements. I wanted the scares to come from humanity.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, it seems like opening it up to a film, it could really go in 100 different directions. And is that scary for you to think about, the plot that you've set and potentially being altered? I mean, I would think that that's a real risk to, to have it made into a film, even though it's inviting and exciting. What's your vision for that, and how I realize you haven't made films before, but how do you avoid it going someplace you don't want it to go?
You can't. I mean, like,
You can't?
once it's like, yeah, I mean, like, Hollywood is just this weird beast that I don't really understand. But like, I've been talking to producers and like, they've had this vision for like TV series and movies, and like it's not the same. It's never going to be the same as the book, and I'm fine. I'm okay with that if they want to do that. The one thing that I said, and like I said, I haven't like accepted this offer with Warner Brothers yet, so I'm still out. So like the one thing that I said, I was like, I will not allow you to whitewash this book, and that is something that I'm really worried about, because the main white characters could have their own movie, and I could see a producer or a director being like, these are easily digestible stories. These white characters are easily digestible, so why don't we just focus on these characters? And every producer I've talked to, I've been like, that is something that's non-negotiable. Like, if you're going to like make this into a series or a movie, like there needs to be representation as there is representation in the book. Like, it doesn't, like, if you try to whitewash the Asian character, if you try to whitewash, like just dismiss the black character, it would not make it would be completely different. So that's the one thing. other than that, like how they're gonna go with it, like I think some of them want to lean into like gross out horror, like Blumhouse type style, which I'm like, whatever, okay, as long as you do this one thing that you don't, that I said. I don't have control of that though, once I sign anything, so, yeah. Unless I do some writing on it, which I said maybe I would, you know, so,
So become playwright.
well, like a screenwriter,
Screen-
yeah. Yeah. But I don't know if that's really what I wanna do, but we'll see.
Alright. Should we go sign some books?
Sure.
Alright, thank
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Really appreciate it. Sequoia's here in spirit.
Yeah.
Wish him well.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, yeah.
You didn't wear a coat, huh?
He doesn't own pants anymore.
Really?
Just short. You know, that might
So how
have
long,
to change in
how many
another
inches of snow will put in those
couple
little pants?
weeks.
He outgrew every pair I had for him.
Is there an inch of, in depth of snow where he has to wear long pants?
I don't have any. He doesn't have any that fit.
Some old stuff.
Are you gonna go get a book?
Free money.
Not free money.
Kind of go with the fact that
That is money for you to go buy a book if you want to.
Oh, I have so much good news that you have